Today's episode of Between the Covers is brought to you by All Lit Up, Canada's independent online bookstore and literary space for readers of emerging, quirky, and acclaimed indie books. All Lit Up is your Canadian connection for award-winning fiction and poetry, author interviews, book roundups, recommendations, and more. The only online retailer dedicated to Canadian literature, All Lit Up features books from 60 literary publishers. And now they offer ebooks in accessible formats through their eBooks for Everyone collection. All Lit Up makes it easy to discover and buy exciting contemporary Canadian literature all in one place. Check out All Lit Up at www.alllitup.ca. That's ALLLITUP.ca. U.S. readers can also shop All Lit Up close to home, save on shipping when they purchase books from its bookshop.org affiliate shop. Browse selected titles at bookshop.org/shop/all-lit-up. Today's episode is also brought to you by Misinterpretation, a ruminative and propulsive novel by Albanian-American fiction writer Lydia Joga. Heralded as absolutely gorgeous, taut as a thriller, lovely as a watercolor by Jennifer Croft, and exceptional by Idra Novi. Misinterpretation dives deep into the human psyche. Based in present-day New York City, an Albanian interpreter reluctantly agrees to work with a Kosovar torture survivor during his therapy sessions, and soon finds herself entangled in his struggles. As the client's dreams stir up her own buried memories and risky decisions stack up, Misinterpretation prompts readers to consider the boundary between compassion and self-preservation, and to examine the darker legacies of family and country. Misinterpretation is out September 3rd from Tin House and available for pre-order now. Prior to 2022, sci-fi and fantasy conversations were a more regular part of the show. Whether early conversations with William Gibson, Neil Stephenson, China Mieville, and Kelly Link, or more recent ones with Jeff Vandermeer, Nnedi Okorafor, N.K. Jemisin, and Ted Chiang, and of course the 3 conversations with Ursula K. Le Guin, 2022 was the year of Crafting with Ursula, where so many great writers, Karen Joy Fowler, Kim Stanley Robinson, Becky Chambers, and Adrienne Marie Brown, to name just a few, came on the show to discuss their work in relation to some aspect of Le Guin's. But I notice now, looking back over the 18 months since that series ended, that I haven't yet returned to form with regular guests from sci-fi and fantasy. So as a first gesture in that direction, it makes me happy that the last conversation with one of the most exciting new voices in the genre, Vajra Chandrasekhara, is followed today with Grandmaster of Sci-Fi and Fantasy Nalo Hopkinson about her first new novel in over a decade, one well worth the wait, the remarkable Blackheart Man. Like the book, the conversation is about many things: the intersection of fantasy and history, the oral versus the written, about Caribbeanness in Nalo's alternate history of the archipelago, a history that is also a fully imagined different culture with different gender and family dynamics, racial politics, and more, and yet a conjured civilization that is animated by something that remains distinctly Caribbean in mode, gesture, sensibility, and speech. And also a conversation about writing challenges, navigating challenges of arriving to the page, whether the obstacles are material, physical and bodily, or cognitive. Like the conversation with Vajra, it is one for the ages, I think. If you enjoy conversations like this, long form, in-depth explorations that take their time and create the space for nuance and complexity and even contradiction, if this is something of value to you, consider joining the Between the Covers community as a listener supporter. Every supporter gets resources with each and every conversation, pointing you to what I discovered while preparing and what we reference during the conversation. And every supporter is invited to help shape the future of the show. Who to invite going forward. Plus, there are simply a ton of other possible things to choose from. Rare collectibles, including some great vintage 1980s Twilight Zone and Interzone magazines that Karen Joy Fowler donated that include her work. Or the Tin House Early Reader subscription, which is often full and unavailable, but where recently a handful of slots have opened up all at once, where people get 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public. And lastly, I'll mention, among many other things, the bonus audio archive, which is immense and ever-growing. Some examples in it include Daniel Jose Older reading a mesmerizing chapter from a forthcoming work, Ted Chiang reading an essay on why Silicon Valley really fears AI, to Vadra's translation from Sinhalese to English of an excerpt of a short story that caused its writer in Sri Lanka to be jailed for anti-Buddhist sentiment. An excerpt he not only translates for us, but reads and contextualizes. You can check this all out at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And now for today's conversation with none other than Nalo Hopkinson. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is Grandmaster of Science Fiction and Fantasy, Nalo Hopkinson. Hopkinson is the youngest recipient and the first woman of African descent to receive this lifetime honor from the Science Fiction Writers of America, whose past winners include Robert Heinlein, Ray Bradbury, William Gibson, Samuel Delany, and Ursula K. Le Guin. Born in Jamaica to a writer father and librarian mother and raised in Guyana and Trinidad, Hopkinson moved to Toronto when she was 16, and Canada has been her home for much of her adult life. She received a master's in writing from Seton Hill University, has taught at UC Riverside and at Clarion, Clarion West and Clarion South, and is currently a professor in the School of Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia. Her debut novel, Brown Girl in the Ring, received the Locus Award for Best First Novel, and she won the John W. Campbell Memorial Prize for Best New Writer. Her second novel, Midnight Robber, was a finalist for the Hugo, Nebula, and Tiptree Awards for Best Novel, and her first story collection, Skinfolk, won the World Fantasy Award. Her many other novels and collections include The Salt Roads, The New Moon's Arms, Falling in Love with Hominids, and her YA novel, The Chaos, and her 2013 novel, Sister Mine, winner of the Andre Norton Nebula Award for middle grade and young adult fiction that year. In 2022, her short story, Broad Duddy Water, A Sunken Story, was awarded the Theodore Sturgeon Memorial Award for the best science fiction short story, published in the previous year. Hopkinson is also the editor of many anthologies, including Whispers from the Cotton Tree Root, Caribbean Fabulist Fiction, So Long Been Dreaming, Post-Colonial Science Fiction and Fantasy, and is co-editor of the British Fantasy Award-winning People of Color Destroy Science Fiction special issue of Lightspeed magazine. She's the 2018 recipient of the Octavia Butler Memorial Award for an author whose writing exemplifies the spirit of Butler's work, and she's a founding member of the Carl Brandon Society, which aims to further the conversation on race and ethnicity in sci-fi and fantasy. Nalo Hopkinson is here today to talk about one of her two books coming out this year, not her upcoming short story collection, Jamaica Ginger and Other Concoctions, which arrives this October, But nevertheless, to whet your appetite for the collection, I will read what Forward said in its starred review of that book. A commanding short story collection, Caribbean Canadian Nalo Hopkinson's Jamaica, Ginger, and Other Concoctions, blends ecological awareness, cultural heritage, and fantastical happenings. Climate change is a recurring theme. There are diseased, parched landscapes and ravaging floods. Many of the characters are resourceful women of color who are determined to improve their troubled environments. They summon remarkable scientific, technological, and mechanical abilities to heal others and solve problems. Enriched with a marrow of emotion, the short stories of Jamaica Ginger and Other Concoctions move beyond bleak dystopian landscapes into a curious universe marked by damage and possibility. Nalo Hopkinson is here today, however, to talk about her long-awaited, much-anticipated new novel from Saga Press, Blackheart Man. Publishers Weekly calls the book a triumph, and Library Journal says, Hopkinson's latest is a mesmerizing novel about colonialism, magic, and myth. Hopkinson's incredible skill for world building is obvious. Every piece of lore, magical element, and unfamiliar word is seamlessly layered into the story. The world feels alive far beyond the text. The characters are painted just as richly. The politics of race, class, and colonization cause dangerous island-wide conflict, but personal questions about love, family, and camels are equally engaging. Much like the Blackheart Man of legend, readers will be swallowed whole by this novel and reemerge completely changed. Welcome to Between the Covers, Nalo Hopkinson.
Thank you so much, David. Thanks for having me.
So at the beginning of the advanced reader's copy of Blackheart Man, there's a note to the early readers of the novel from the editorial director of Saga Press, Joe Monti. My small connection with Joe is that back in 2018, when Ursula K. Le Guin passed away, Joe reached out to me, having read a tribute that I wrote to her that originally had the title The Holographic Universe of Ursula K. Le Guin, but when it was published by LitHub, they changed the title to Editing to the End. Joe reached out after reading it, suggesting we meet for a drink when he was in town for the memorial. At the beginning of your new book, Joe recounts curating a reading series in Chelsea around the time your first book came out, 25 years ago now. How you, after winning some major awards, were the it writer, so much so that DJ Spooky, a sci-fi fantasy lover himself, gave up a big gig in Germany to provide background music for your reading of a scene from a forthcoming book, the book that would become Midnight Robber. Joe calls it the most alive reading experience of his life. Then he flash forwards a quarter century to 2021, when you became the youngest person at the age of 60 to be named a Grandmaster. And then Joe notes, thinking of how this is your first novel in too many years, that, quote, sometimes life is a crooked way forward. And he finishes by saying, quote, I'll give you a clue how I feel about it. As I first read the draft, I thought of Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. So the reason I start here with this looking back across time, and also Joe's phrase, sometimes life is a crooked way forward, is because Blackheart Man has, I suspect, had a very crooked way forward to arrive to this moment. For instance, as I prepared for today, reading various interviews of yours from 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago, if an interviewer asked you what you were working on next, it was often Blackheart Man. I, like Joe, love this novel, but given that this show is listened to by many writers and art makers and translators and aspiring people in all those fields, I was thinking maybe we could start with the crooked way forward. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about the novel and you alongside the novel in terms of how it arrived to this moment.
Yes, I can. Yes, Blackheart Man took a long, long time to work on. I got it most of the way to finished many years ago, but it wasn't close enough for my then publisher. So they canceled it, and I had to revisit, which ended up being a good thing because it needed work. But at the time when I turned it in the first time, I was too anemic to write a novel. I literally could not read to the end of a sentence, much less write one. I kept having to start over and start over and start over. So it was a really troubled process to get it to where it is now. But even though after I'd had to have that book canceled and for many years couldn't look at it, every time I did take the courage to look at it, still really liked it.
Mm.
I liked what I was doing. I was proud of what I was doing. I thought I was doing something fresh. 15 years on, it may no longer be fresh, but it is to me. And so many people were encouraging when they heard excerpts. A former postdoc of mine invited me to join a co-writing hangout that she had developed, and that was how I finally finished it. It was meeting 8:30 every morning with those women, some academics, some not, who were all working on writing or something to do with their careers. So yeah, I think it's the Jamaican saying that evil travels in straight lines.
Huh.
So, so I guess by corollary, one might assume the book is good.
It really is.
Thank you.
We have a couple questions from others that happen to not be about the narrative of Blackheart Man, but rather about the narrative of you outside of the book with the book. So I thought I would put those up front, and we can spend a little time longer on this period, this indeterminate period, with you alongside the manuscript. And then afterwards, after these two questions, we can properly dive into the world you've created. So our first question is from Nisi Shaw. Like Blackheart Man, Shaw's first novel was also alternate history. Theirs was set in the Belgian Congo, the 2016 Nebula finalist and contemporary classic Everfair, whose sequel Kinning came out at the beginning of this year. They're also the co-author of Writing the Other, Bridging Cultural Differences for Successful Fiction, among many other books. So here's a question for you from Nisi.
This is Nisi Shaw, and I wanted to ask you, Nalo, this question. Well, I'll set it up as, so we are often told as writers that what we learn as we write a novel is how to write that novel. So what did you learn while you were writing Blackheart Man? Can you share anything with us about how you wrote it, what you learned by writing it, how you learned to write it as you wrote it? Thanks.
Big question, especially since my memory does what it wants to when it wants to. And first of all, I want to thank Nisi because they have created a tea blend to celebrate this novel of mine, tea blend called Blackheart that I had the honor of tasting last week when they sent some of it to the Clarion workshop where I was teaching. And it's lovely, it's yummy. What did I learn? Oh, I learned that camels are one of the most extraordinary creatures on this earth. I learned, I mean, the common wisdom is that children and animals will steal your story away if you're trying to write something, so be careful. And I know this, but I'm a little ornery. So I learned that putting not one, but perhaps 13 children in a novel is going to mean escapades and is going to mean the copy editor having to save my cognitively challenged ass by figuring out who was named what, who was what gender, who was alive at the end and who was not. Spoiler. So I learned that. That doesn't mean it's going to stop me from writing children because how much fun they are so willing to take things in ways that the plot doesn't want to go. I learned that there is a lot of value in liking what you're creating. That alone, for me anyway, could keep me going when I was despairing of the novel ever getting finished. So to respect what you're doing, those are some of the things that come up. If others come up as we're talking, I'll interrupt us with them.
Okay. Let me extend Nisi's question for another beat. One thing that I find both moving and generous on your part in interview after interview, including today already, is how matter-of-factly and readily you discuss various life challenges to get you to the page. You've talked frequently and movingly about your several year period of homelessness and how you were held afloat by many small but vital acts of support from various people in the sci-fi and fantasy community. You talk about how your learning disorders and fibromyalgia and ADHD impact the act of writing for you. And you've discussed the stress of navigating the consequences of breach of contract on this novel in its earlier iteration years ago. All of these things, most writers keep behind the curtain. And I think because of that, they feel extra helpful and useful to hear them. But thinking of Nisi's question about what did you learn, I wanted to ask about the other things you were doing in the decade between novels to see if any of them influenced both your ability to finish the book, but also how you finished the book. For instance, for several years of that time, you worked on comics for the first time in the Sandman universe. And you said on the Caribbean Science Fiction Network podcast that it has changed your relationship to plot because you were required to plot in advance, which you had never done in your own work. And this decade seems particularly marked by collaboration, deep collaboration with the comics themselves, of course, but also you collaborated with Nisi on a story called Jamaican Ginger that you wrote together for an anthology called Stories for Chip that celebrated the work of Samuel Delany. And lastly, as you've already mentioned, during COVID, the writer Kathy Thomas pulled together an online writing group of academic women, largely women of color, where there was an open window on Zoom every day to co-work alongside each other. So sort of as an addendum to Nisi's question, I wondered if comics or collaboration or anything else during this time period outside the book became part of bringing it home to its final form, and if so, how?
Definitely all those things contributed in some way. Working on comics, as you said, is a deeply collaborative process because I'm writing the script and then it goes to artists and 3 or 4 artists each in charge of a different aspect of the thing. And then it went to a bunch of editors. And I was learning comics writing as I went. So the first 2 issues of House of Whispers, I had to rewrite 8 times.
Did you say 8 times or 80 times?
I said 8.
8 times.
There wasn't room for 80 because the thing had to come out once a month. And I learned a bit more about collaboration when DC asked if I would like a co-writer, and I said, yes, please. And they paired me up with Dan Waters, who was writing Lucifer in the same new Sandman series. And he's quite experienced, both as a comics writer and as a collaborator. He was wonderful to work with and helped me work out some of that plotting ahead of time that was being so oppressive to me because I'm a pantser, not a plotter. How it's played into my current writing, I'm not entirely certain. I'm less scared of plot. It was gratifying to discover that even with stories that Dan and I had heavily plotted, I was still finding surprises within the stories as I was writing them that kept it fresh for me, that the plot is not a straitjacket and you can mess with it at any time. I learned how it was possible to collaborate with people in a way that made the result better than either of you could together. So for instance, my main character is Elzuli in the comic. She is a goddess from the Afro-Caribbean pantheon, the Yoruba pantheon. And I have her living in New Orleans on a boat. And we open with a party on the boat. So I write that, then I hand it to Domo Stanton, who was the inker. And he decided that it wasn't just a boat, it was one of those grand New Orleans river boats. That of course you could hold a big ball in and there's chandeliers and he had dancing boys and it just clicked so much better. Of course, Elzuli is this goddess of plenty and wealth and sumptuousness. Yes, she's not going to live in a little houseboat.
That's great.
Yeah.
Some of the anecdotes about Samuel Delany and you that I gleaned from preparing for today include a moment you point to as pivotal in your 20s, when you turned over one of his books and saw his photo and realized this was science fiction by a Black writer, something that you had not encountered before, and also not knowing until then that he was a Black writer. later you studied under him at Clarion, and then in an interview you did with Terry Bisson, where he listed a whole bunch of authors, Delaney, Butler, Le Guin, and others, and then asked you to respond about each one in one sentence each. For Delaney, you said, "All hail the king." So, so here's a question for you, a final question outside the book, and then we'll start to explore the book itself. So here's a question for you from the king, Samuel Delany. And I should say that it cuts off abruptly in the middle of the last word, the word writing. So we can all fill the word writing. You sort of know it's the word writing, but we can all in our minds complete the word from Samuel Delany.
When I retired from Temple, it occurred to me that if I had retired 3 years earlier, I would probably have had another fairly sizable novel in my bibliography. I'm wondering, Nalo, if you find that teaching is easier than writing, and plus the fact that it gives you an income, a set income that you can count on, that it tends to edge out writing.
First of all, my God, you're a thorough researcher, and thank you so much for getting that question from Chip. Oh, so sweet. And yeah, the dilemma of teaching versus writing. I don't find teaching easier because it requires more outward-facing organization than my ADHD brain can easily manage. I love the actual being in the classroom, but it is not easier. It does take up a lot of brain space. So yes, in that sense, it does edge out writing, not because it's easier, but because it's harder, and because it is the thing bringing in the income, and because you just want to do a good job. You've got all those people counting on you, and you want to do a good job. So yes, teaching does edge it out a little. On the other hand, the questions and the insights that I get every term from students, I think help push my own craft, because they'll ask questions that you think, well, that's obvious, and you realize you have no idea how to answer it. Or, there will be something in a particular person's writing that you keep pointing out, and you keep being irritated that they're not listening to you. And then you think, why am I so irritated by this? And you realize you're sensitive to it because it's something you do in your own writing. So in that way, it keeps me honest, and it keeps me curious and engaged. So yeah, it's a trade-off.
So in Locus magazine recently, you talk about how while the new book has many elements that your longtime fans will recognize, that nevertheless, this new novel is different, a departure in some ways, not just in terms of what you've written before, but in terms of Caribbean fantastical literature more broadly. So I was hoping maybe you could talk to us about this as you orient us to the setting and scenario of Blackheart Man.
The thing is, because it took me like a decade and a half to write it, that statement is now only partially true, that it's new. I mean, we've seen novels from Leonie Ross that create not just an alternate history, but an alternate Caribbean altogether. So it's happening more and more. And yet, the Caribbean literature with which I grew up tended to be very much set in the consensus world, creating an alternate history and an alternate set of world building when you're already underrepresented probably can be a stretch too far. But because I grew up in fantasy where that happens all the time, it was perhaps easier for me to conceive of. The book is a departure for me personally. It's an expansion, for one thing. It's taken my obsession with language and spoken language and just completely pushed it, because I had to come up with a 16th century Caribbean language from a country that never existed, and then to do it again for the 18th century, and to do it for different socioeconomic registers. So I've done that a little bit in the past, but not this much. It also, in the way that it deals with magic, I remember my agent reading it and calling me up to talk to me about it in the first draft. And he said, "You break magic."
You break magic?
By the end of this, you break magic. And I hadn't thought of it that way. And I kind of do. So that's also a departure. Usually you start the world with magic. Maybe it's not that obvious. You end the world with magic. This one, I'll leave it up to readers how it ends. The other thing was writing a male character, a male point of view character, that in some ways is no different from writing a character of any gender, but also there are always going to be things that are specific, not just to masculinity, but his type of masculinity and to himself as a person. That was a challenge for me. There is a sex scene in the book that took me many, many years to sort of just buckle down and write it because I was writing so outside. I was writing two men having sex. I thought, I need to get this feeling plausible. So I kept pushing my comforts that way, as one does.
Well, your book takes the real phenomenon of maroon communities of previously enslaved people living autonomously, and imagines that they weren't ultimately subdued. In Blackheart Man, it is a 200-year period between the time they fight off the colonizers and the current day of the novel, when the colonizers have returned for the first time since, under the rubric possibly of trade, but with the subtext of possible invasion and future subjugation. You've said that there are echoes of the 17th century community Palmares in Brazil, a maroon community that lasted a century and had between 11 and 20,000 people, the largest fugitive community ever in Brazil, and one that was governed using Central African political models blended with aspects of both local and European models. In my reading about it, there were 6 Portuguese expeditions that tried to conquer them but failed until an army was ultimately raised to defeat them. And I appreciated the excuse to go and read more about this community called a quilombo, which is also the name of a movie I saw long ago when studying Portuguese. But I also learned some interesting things reading your book about the Caribbean in a backward sort of way too. For a while, I wasn't sure if this was supposed to be a fantastical Caribbean at all, because there were elements that seemed definitely at first to me from elsewhere. For instance, the traffic in the main town was horse, donkey, tricycle, and camel, and one of the main spices was nutmeg. And I made notes of all these things as I was reading, and in my ignorance, I associated these things with other parts of the world. But then later when I went and looked them up, lo and behold, camels were actually used in Cuba, Tobago, Jamaica, Barbados, and other places in the archipelago for several centuries. And Grenada is today one of the largest nutmeg producers in the world. You've done this in other books, for instance, with the swimming pigs of Bermuda, the pigs that were left once on a deserted island, which now swim out to boats seeking treats. And there's a sly nod to them in this book too, very much in passing, when you refer to the deserted Boer Island. These details all feel really fantastical, but they're actually all real. But given, as you say, that one way this book is breaking new ground in Caribbean fantastical literature is that you're not only doing alternate history, but creating an entirely new culture within that alternate history. Let's do a little bit of the world building together for listeners. And I was thinking maybe we could start with the cosmology of the twin goddess, Mama Kona, and how it functions in this society.
I'm not the only person to have said that the history of the Caribbean is so complex that it can make sense to resort to the fantastical to try to represent everything that's going on, and it's been hybridized and creolized into it. Mama Kona is a twin African goddess I create, and I'm often using African-based riverine goddesses, water goddesses. So I knew I wanted Mama Agua. So a nod to Mama Jo, who is Mama Dilo, who's a version of Yemaya, who's part of that pantheon. So knowing what I know about what happens to language, I pushed the 2 words together to get Mama Agua. And then thought, when I decided to use a twin goddess, I used the fact that the islands, one of its main sources of industry is the pitch lake. So that can be a goddess. So she's Mama Pish. And to put them together, I believe I was probably drawing on the Haitian woman revolutionary Anna Kaona and just stuck Mama and Kaona together. So yes, I'm hybridizing the already hybridized. The fact that Grenada, the Spice Island, has such a lockdown on nutmeg. Nutmeg was brought there by the Dutch, who then proceeded to try and control it and would sometimes travel to this, I think then independent island, and burn down nutmeg plantations in order to be able to control the price of nutmeg.
Wow.
Back home. Once you start looking the history up, I mean, you can never only know bits of it from living there, and I do. I had to have done. Once you start looking the history up, there's so much to draw on that at some point I have to decide whether it matters how legible that is to people, or whether I'm just going to make a world that the experience of it can stand on its own, or maybe future grad students will have a field day looking everything up.
Well,
I sort of hope both.
I hope so too. I wanted to ask you about your interest in twins. In this book, we have the twin goddess, Mama Kona, who has her seaward aspect, Mamagua, and her landward aspect, Mama Piche. And we have someone who serves as her human avatar, always a child from what is called a twinning birth, who is born of a mother without a father involved in conception, where the child herself is a twin of her mother. But there's also an interest in twins and doubles in your writing before this, the clones and your story, Message in the Bottle, the twin sisters in the story, East Hound, but most notably your last novel, Sister Mine, which also has twinned semi-divine sisters, in this case, conjoined twins, that when separated, one retains magical powers and the other does not. It made me wonder if there's something that attracts you to twins and doubles, generally speaking, but also maybe twins and doubles when it comes to women and to sisters more specifically.
I mean, does one ever really know why one is drawn to something?
Yeah.
I know that even though I am not a practitioner of Yoruba, one or two, depending on how you count it, of the other gods are the Ibeji, the twins, who have various significances in various aspects of the religion as it was taken out into the diaspora. I'm also fascinated by the idea of parthenogenesis. So really in Blackheart Man, the girl who is chosen is a parthenogenetic child of her mother. She's a clone. She's a natural clone. And to my disappointment, when I went and looked up the biology of parthenogenesis, discovered that it's actually not possible for it to happen in humans. So it was so neatly explained Jesus, or at least
right.
part of Jesus.
Yes.
I mean, is being mailed through a spanner into the works, but it's just not possible. And then I remembered I write fantasy. So I could do what I want. Yeah, there's something about the being able to be a community unto yourself. So there's a type of, they're called stick creatures. It's an insect that's related to, can't remember the name of the animal.
Is it a praying mantis?
Yes, right.
That's what your hand looked like, the gesture you were just making.
Yeah. So there's a type of insect, they're called stick creatures. They're related to praying mantises. And there's a small community of them somewhere, I forget where all the males died out quite a while ago, and the females started reproducing by parthenogenesis. So all of them are related to each other as identical, going down the generations of this creature. And it doesn't need, I'm not sure it would know what to do with male stick creatures if you reintroduce them. It doesn't need them. And there's something about that fact that life will find a way, that we keep going somehow, no matter what. We'll change our biology if necessary. Something will happen that I find really profoundly hopeful, given that humanity can be simultaneously such a fuck up and so resourceful and interesting and social. So the fact that we might keep going despite ourselves says a lot to me.
Yeah. Well, as a first step toward introducing our main character, it feels important to mention gender in your worlds as a preface to that. You've long envisioned worlds outside the gender binary. Your story, Fisherman, follows a trans fisherman. Something to Hitch Meat To follows workers at a company making porn for straight men, but many of whom are largely not so. And the world of Blackheart Man is deeply woman-centric, whether we're thinking of the legend of the 3 witch women who liberated the island 200 years before, to the fact that only women and third-sexed people can captain a boat. It's a deep part of the fabric of this culture. But perhaps the most profound difference from our world is the family structure, as marriages are of 3 people, usually 2 husbands and a wife. And there's a long engagement period for any love triangle to be when people can be sexually promiscuous with whomever they want. It also seems like more people than not are bisexual. So the social structures are very fluid with regards to sexual freedom in many ways at once. We'll talk more later about how this family system informs the narrative itself, but let's introduce our protagonist to listeners, a main character who, in this matriarchal world, is a cis man, bisexual, indigenous, and really an utter delight to have as our lens into this world, both, I think, for the comedy and tragedy he produces, and also for the ways he has his feet in different worlds simultaneously as a border crosser of sorts. So introduce us to Vekosi a little bit.
Vekosi is what happens when Nalo tries to write an entitled stoner grad student. Yeah, entitled stoner grad student, because that is what he is. But as you noted, he is indigenous. He's Caribbean. He is queer, which is not an issue in the world of the story. I wouldn't say that more characters are bisexual than not. It might be that those are the ones I focus on. So there's a lot that was ripe and ready for Vekosi. He is about to graduate from the island's university, which finds and collects lost books that have been lost to history and to war. So for his graduation process, he has to go out and collect one of these books that he has sourced. We probably all know people like him, and they are often, but not always, male, often young, privileged, not exactly aware of their own privilege, very aware of fair and unfair, but not always really nuanced in how that plays out in the real world. Very intelligent, sure that they know the answer to everything and that their way is always best because they can see it the most clearly. And so they hear about just kind of messing things up through their own inability to be humble. He means so very well, but he is just getting in the way of what people need to do. He is not understanding the lives of people less privileged than he. His solutions are often just inconceivable to anybody else. He has a lot to learn. As much as writing is only partially fun for me, he was fun to write. I never knew what he was going to get up to next. And I'd get a flash because I'm not writing linearly, I'd get a flash of an image and think, but how in the world would he survive that? Well, I have to put it in the book now because I have no idea.
I love that.
There's a deep compassion to him. Even as he's a fuck up, there's a deep compassion to him. That's his saving grace.
Well, now that we have a rough preliminary sketch of the world you've built, I wanted to ask you whether it references other books or other works, or whether it comes more right out of your forehead like Athena did, fully armored, right out of Zeus's forehead. The reason I ask is because of how some of your books, from the beginning of your career, have been in conversation with other stories in some way. Your father was one of the actors and playwrights in Derek Walcott's Trinidad Theater Workshop, and your debut novel, Brown Girl in the Ring, took the framework from one of Walcott's plays, Tijan and Its Brothers. In your second novel, Midnight Robber, you have an AI supercomputer called Granny Nanny. But in our world, Granny Nanny is a legendary Jamaican woman who fought off British soldiers, eventually gaining freedom for a maroon community in the hills of Jamaica. a woman so legendary that you've said that the British soldiers thought she could catch their bullets with her butt cheeks and fart them back like a machine gun, which is amazing. And Sister Mine has a relation to Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, but also makes nods to West African deities with characters like Grandmother Ocean, related to Oshun, and General Gun to Ogun. You've also talked about how when you visited Kamau Brathwaite's literature class at NYU, you had the realization that Ariel and Caliban in The Tempest could be seen as the house Negro and the field Negro, respectively, which went on to inform your short story Shift. More generally, you've talked about how folk tales are great for learning dynamic storytelling and how to structure a plot with forward motion. So, all of which made me curious if there were any ghost books or ghost tales haunting this one.
I'm sure there are, but I think with this one, I would have made any references so sly that I myself don't remember them at this point. I know there was one thing I did right at the beginning where it's not so much a book as a field of knowledge. Vekosi is standing on a cliff looking out over the water, and he describes the wave pattern as seed scale, which is straight up from fractal math. I just took the phrase out of fractal math and put it in because I knew what he was describing was fractal. For me, that's part of the joy of writing in this mode, that is science fiction and fantasy, is that it is so pastiched. It really, in many ways, looks at the structure of story to tell its stories. So it's kind of meta that way. And so I do enjoy kind of nodding to things. I have nodded to the Hidden Library of Timbuktu, where it was discovered that under pressure of war, people had taken precious books that would have been written by hand and bound by hand and hidden them, sometimes underground, sometimes in hidden cupboards. And there's a whole unseen library underneath Timbuktu.
And it was done by Donkey too, by the way. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah.
They emptied the National, I don't know if it was the National Library or the National Museum, but by Donkey to hide it in all these people's basements before, I think it was ISIS, before ISIS or Al Qaeda was arrive.
Yeah, I love human beings. Because the story of the Great Library of Alexandria can still bring tears to my eyes. You burned books, my God. And so to have a library that saved itself is where I originally got the idea for this university does this as a practice, that it finds books being one of the non-human casualties of war, knowledge being such, that it finds books and saves them and commits them to memory in a way that they cannot be destroyed. So there is that. There's the folktale. It's a Taino folktale from, I believe, Trinidad, of the village that killed and ate a hummingbird. And hummingbirds were sacred. They were not to be killed. And the next day, the pitch lake, because Trinidad does have one, the pitch lake rose up and covered the village completely. So some of that is hovering in there. It's where you get the colibris, who were not hummingbirds, but that was their original inspiration. I looked up one of the Taino words for hummingbird, and it was colibri. And I thought, all right, if you're coming in with an English that just sort of homogenizes everything to English speaking patterns, you would turn colibri into colibri. So there's all kinds of stuff like that to be found. A lot of it based in older stories, some of it based in modern forms of knowledge, modern writing. And I do it as such a matter of fact that I forget.
Well, one of the tales that exists both inside your world and in ours is the tale of the Blackheart Man. And I was wondering if we could hear the brief version as it manifests in your imagined world at the beginning of chapter 6.
The Blackheart Man story, as it comes from Jamaica and Trinidad, is a tale of a man who's a predator upon children, who comes at night in a black carriage or a black car, depending on when the parent is telling the tale to try and scare their children. And he's a horrible man who hunts children and eats their living hearts out of their bodies. And that's pretty much the story. It's told to scare children. I'm pretty sure it's not told anymore. In Barbados, they call him the Heart Man. It might actually hark back to something that happened. it might not. But just this powerful idea of this predator, this silent predator, in a black vehicle so that it fades against the blackness of night. You can imagine why children would have been scared. So I rang the changes on Blackheart Man as I went through the novel, and I created sometimes folk tales that don't exist. And this one in chapter 6 about the man who hunts and eats the Cascadura fish and its eggs, near as I remember, completely out of my own head. And the unfortunate, the very tragic thing that happens to him makes him, out of sorrow and grief, become black-hearted. I played a lot with the word blackheart, which probably also is where we get blackguard. And what does it mean to have a heart that is black? What does it mean? It's not just terrifying, it's probably also very tragic. So the thing that happens to Titan that causes him to throw himself into the liquid middle of the pitch lake, the consequences of his actions cause him so much grief that he's referred to as being black-hearted. And that was something that came much later in writing the novel, when I wanted another iteration of this idea of the Blackheart Man. Okay. There was a man named Titan who often amused himself by hunting and eating Cascadura and its eggs. Cascadura fish live in the pockets of water that pool in the crannies of hardened piche that is Mama Piche's body. Cascadura are Mama Piche's children, and thus taboo to eat. Titan knew this well, but loved the taste too bad. Titan and his spouses had 6 children, but Titan's favorite was the youngest, a sweet boy named Alexei. When Titan went hunting in the bush and brought home peccary and guinea fowl for his family, he would prepare the meat and set aside the choicest parts for himself and Alexei. As to his wife and co-husband and the other 5 children, they had to content themselves with gnawing on the tough pieces remaining. But even Alexei didn't know of Titan's habit of marauding Cascadura nests. That he did in private, hiding in the bush to light a fire on which to cook his prey. He would squat by the fire and consume fish and eggs and all by himself, gorging till bellyful. When Mama Piche learned how Titan thus defiled her body and her children by not sharing her bounty, she became enraged. She disguised herself as Titan's wife and slayed Alexei. She cut out the boy's heart, and still in her guise as Titan's wife, fed it to Titan, claiming it was the tender heart of a young wild hog he had brought home from the hunt. After Titan ate the heart, Mama Piche revealed to him the gutted body of his dead son. She said, "Oh, black-hearted man, as you have cut out my heart by killing and eating my children, so I have cut out yours by making you feast on your own child. Eat no more feasts in solitary, or I will compel you to slice out and eat the hearts of your remaining pickings." Mad with grief, Titan took himself to the soft, hot center of the mother lake and threw himself in. Mama Piche took him to her bosom, and there the Blackheart Man remains, keening and mourning and begging her forgiveness. But when pickins are own way and don't heed their parents, Mama Piche sends her Blackheart Man after them to slice them open and devour their living hearts from their breasts. And while he does so, he weeps for his folly and for his own lost Alexei.
Been listening to Nalo Hopkinson read from Blackheart Man. Well, before we look at the ways you explore power and race in Blackheart Man, I wanted to step away from the book and look at these questions in relation to you and the science fiction and fantasy community in the world first, as I see a connection between how you position yourself there in the world and how you do so within the narrative of this novel. PM Press has this great series of books called Outspoken Authors that each center an author, and past between the covers guests, Karen Joy Fowler, Jonathan Lethem, Kim Stanley Robinson, and Ursula K. Le Guin all have books in this series, as do today's cameo questioners, Samuel Delaney and Nisi Shaw. These books often include a long-form interview as well as a medley of smaller pieces by the author. In your book, which is a really great book, it contains a really substantive interview of you by Terry Bisson, some less-known short stories, and the speech you gave at the 2009 International Conference of the Fantastic in the Arts called Report from Planet Midnight, which is also the title of the book as a whole. The theme of that year's conference was race in the literature of the fantastic. And as an invited guest speaker, you were already anxious about this talk before Race Fail happened. But then Race Fail happened between the invitation and the delivery of the speech, which only made the lead up to this speech all the more fraught. I could try to give a summary of what Race Fail was in its broadest strokes, something that started with a white writer making a post with tips about how to write the other, but I know you could do a much better job than I could. So before we talk about your speech, how would you orient people in the most general way to Race Fail, to people listening today who aren't following the controversies in the sci-fi and fantasy world? How would you characterize it to them?
So in 2009, I think started not by that writer who was Elizabeth there, but started around her post about why white writers should write characters of color, should not, so step away from it. That post that seemed to me fairly innocuous at the time. I came back a couple days later and the thing had blown the hell up. And it blew up into some long overdue discussions on race and racism in science fiction community, which had been happening in small ways for quite some time. But this was, I think by the time the discussion died down, you could find some 20,000 posts by people, everybody from fans in the community to writers to editors, discussing and arguing about and fighting about and screaming about race and racism in science fiction and fantasy community. And it's a community that has been liberal from the beginning, that has thought of itself as inclusive from the beginning, but that hadn't always understood what inclusivity really meant. That inclusivity isn't welcoming people because they have the same ideas as you and the same history as you, that it is a more nuanced conversation than that. And Race Fail began the process, I think, of having that understanding be more nuanced and further spread out into science fiction fantasy community. So it was scary because you knew that anything you posted, what happened to Elizabeth could happen to you, especially as perhaps a woman of color trying to take part in these discussions. You knew that it was a very tense issue, that it was something that affected people deeply. It certainly has me. And so speaking to it was frightening. And when I got invited to be the writer guest of honor at ICFA, and the topic was race, I knew I had to speak to this. It was terrifying. The final version of the speech didn't actually come to me until a couple hours before I had to give it, because I kept trying different versions of it and it wasn't working. The final version came out of a creativity born of terror that the deadline was coming. My God, the deadline's coming. But I did it as a part performance piece, part speech.
Well, I absolutely love this speech. It's amazing to learn that so much of it came together last minute. It's a speech where you are, for part of it, possessed by an alien ambassador / translator, one who's been studying us, but also one who has earnest questions and confusions that they hope to get clarity on. Some of the things that the translators of this alien people have been confused about and wanted clarification include when humans say, "I don't see race," which they understood as, if I keep very quiet, maybe you won't see me and ask me to do any work. And I'm not a racist, which they have two translations for. One, I can wade through feces without getting any of it on me. And two, my shit don't stink. Where they ultimately, after all of this, presenting this to us for clarification, where ultimately they say, quote, "Our dilemma. To us, someone making this kind of delusional claim is in immediate need of some healing treatments we offer to people who are convinced that they can fly. Such people are a danger to themselves and to others. And yet the communications from your world are replete with this type of statement from people who do not seem to be under treatment of any kind, and few among you take any steps to limit the harm they do. Another part I really love is the contemplation on book covers, how the original cover of Midnight Robber has a brown-skinned girl with black African features, but the Italian cover of the same book has a blue-skinned woman with European features, straight hair, wearing a bra top and a fringed miniskirt. And they note how they see these blue-skinned people everywhere in sci-fi and fantasy, but nowhere in the world itself. With no small amount of anxiety, they're worried about and want to inquire about the fate of these now disappeared blue people. What would you say to these aliens about the preponderance of blue people, whether Avatar or your own characters having been turned blue?
And the god Vishnu often being shown as being blue. As I understand it, he's representing somebody dark-skinned in a Hindu culture that valued lighter skin. What would I say to these aliens? I would say, watch your back. I would explain why the tint of blue, it's sort of often a way of evading actual clear racial markers of people who are not white. I would say, although yes, watch your back. Be careful that you as aliens, because they call us aliens too, can get disappeared. Chances are you won't entirely because there's always resistance. But that if they substitute every time they see a blue character in our storytelling, if they try on dark skin on them that is actually in the colors of skin that humans come in, they might learn something about dominant cultures, attitudes, and guilt about racism.
So the real reason why I bring this speech up and race fail, beyond the joy in sharing all these amazing moments in this speech, is that the thing I like most about the speech is also a quality I like most about Blackheart Man, something that I think makes the book more complex and deeper. In the speech, the alien ambassador who possesses you for the first half makes clear that his people are fallible, not just because they can't find a consensus around the translations. They're not in agreement about how to translate all of these commonly used euphemisms in human culture, but also because they themselves are suffering their own cultural problems, their own issues with race in their own specific context. So they don't come from a place of superiority or purity. And likewise, you present yourself in the speech as fallible and also assert that it's what you do after you make a mistake that counts. Once you return to being yourself in the talk, one of the things you focus on is labor or work, how both magic and technology are ultimately labor-saving devices, and also just how much labor in the real world it takes to even keep one human life going, and how certain portions of society are kept indefinitely disenfranchised to do the drudge work to keep other people's lives moving forward. How both fantasy and sci-fi have the potential to use myth-making to examine and explore ethno-racial power imbalances. And you recount in the book version of the speech that right after the talk, someone approaches you and asks you if you were a Marxist because you, quote unquote, reduced the lofty subject of art to a mere question of labor, where you end by saying, "You can't convince me that art and the labor that creates it can be easily teased apart and considered as separate objects. And you sure as hell can't convince me that the latter is somehow base and impoverished in comparison to the former." These questions are really alive in Blackheart Man. Both the question, I think, of being fallible, even if you come from a people with a long history of being victimized, that even if you are a victim, you still very much can move into the position of victimizer. And also this question of labor, most decidedly, I think, this is evident with the Myrmeki people. So I was hoping you could talk to us about the Myrmeki and what they tell us about the dominant culture of the book, because the dominant culture of the book is a culture that has been victimized and one that might soon be again. And our narrator is speaking from within that culture, and because of that, with all of that culture's blind spots.
And I finished this book years before Israel attacked Gaza again.
Mm.
Um, the fact is that human beings, we create stratified social differences and then treat people as better or worse based on the one stratum that they're in. And that happens right across humanity. It's not an unfamiliar thing. And yet, Chinchin, the island where Blackheart Man takes place, has been created to try and abolish those stratified social differences. And it's gotten a long way, but it's also working with the fact that we are human. So the first thing I thought of was labor, the kind of work that nobody really wants to do, that is the least paid, that is the physically hardest, that is most demanding. I thought, well, if you need a society to run, those things have to happen. You can't have nobody doing them. And the best I could come up with is people sharing them. So many of them are tasks that don't necessarily take a high level of expertise. That's not exactly true. Even the lamplighter needs to know something that you can't just figure out from watching her do it. But they share tasks like the lamplighting every evening, like taking out the night soil in the morning. They share the menial tasks. Of course, people being people, you can imagine that somebody might someday go, I don't feel like doing my route this week. How about I, you know, give this guy something that he can't always get to do it for me. So you pass off the labor. Science fiction fantasy seems to be always wrestling with this question from the first robot in Rossum's Universal Robots, where the word comes from. It's always about we are complicated. We need a lot of work to stay alive. Nobody wants to do the menial work, but we're complicated enough that we can make machines that'll do it for us. Okay, problem solved. Until the machines become so complex that they have their own agency. So then who does the work? And so we keep pushing the problem forward, and we don't yet have an answer, to the point where we get to AI that are using up so much resources to do and that aren't really intelligent. And we're afraid they're going to take over because we don't really like ourselves and we think anybody would. So it's part of what I'm wrestling with in the book, and I couldn't come up with an answer. I just, best I can do is present the problem. And when I decided to take money out of the equation, it makes it even more complex. So it's a society that runs without money. So then who does the menial work and why? And I came up with some answers for that. And one of the intriguing answers is that it argues against economies of scale, because money replaces huge swaths of labor. It stands in for it. When you don't have that, you don't have exponential out of control growth of a society. So it's an island, it functions, it's going to stay small.
Well, I love how we are with our protagonist Vekosi as he discovers counter narratives to the world that he thinks he knows. For instance, all the language he uses that the Mermeki are shocked to hear, or that his own people are described by them as runaways, not freedom fighters, which equally shocks him. Or simply his eyes opening, I think, for the first time around questions of labor and servitude that aren't related to his own people's subjugation. I feel like there's a real generosity you give your characters in this regard as they stumble and fumble in real time. To step back into the quote-unquote real moment for a moment, and to the various times you've meditated on book covers, whether the blue people on the cover of one of your books, or you've mentioned the cover of Snow Crash that sort of obscured the character's Japanese identity, and the many books throughout the years with characters who are brown or black in the narrative but are made white on the cover, something that Le Guin battled against, among others. I think of all of this when I take in the amazing cover of Blackheart Man, which centers an indigenous man's face, flanked by the twinned black goddesses Mamakona. And I wonder how much or how little you feel like things have changed since Race Fail. I know N.K. Jemisin wrote maybe a year or two after that some people felt like the fail in Race Fail was that it had happened at all. But for her, it was not only necessary, but sort of unequivocally for the good. and she welcomed more so-called fails. But how do you see things now, looking back now, 15 years later to then? Is this cover the sign of substantive material change, do you think?
Yes, it is. And many other covers before it in the interim. It was at one point common wisdom amongst publishers that readers wouldn't buy a book with a person of color on the cover. That is absolutely no longer true, as the world realizes that there are a whole lot of people of color. If you say readers, there's lots of us who, actually read. And that as the sensibility in science fiction and fantasy has changed, it is a community that has always been interested in cultures with which it's unfamiliar, learning things it doesn't know, still operating side by each with that same, systematic racism that you have to be really analyzing to be able to fight. But it has changed a whole lot. Going back to one of the Chinese translations of, I think, my first novel, Brown Girl in the Ring, where other translations had done that blue washing and, of the book. But the Chinese translation has a woman who not only has very clearly African features, but she's dark skinned. In fact, she looks so much like a friend of mine, I had to go and get pictures to compare because I thought maybe they'd found a photo of her on the web. And that is a moment I never thought I would see going into science fiction. And for this cover, Joe Monti, the editor, went and found an artist who, like me, is from two different Caribbean worlds, two different Caribbean nations. Somebody who clearly did his research because that man's features are so very indigenous. And I know it's already causing joy amongst readers to see themselves represented. That he then, the way he does it, almost sort of Kandake, the profile of the two queens, the two African goddesses behind him, is just so wonderful. The colors are warm, they're inviting. Artist is just brilliant at what he does. Is a marker, I think, of the fact that these things have changed. I'm not sure they've changed universally, but they have changed in my world, so that there's less of a fight I have to do. And to be fair, with my very first book and my very first editor, Betsy Mitchell, showed me the original conceptual drawings for the cover, and seeing me sort of, my face just went blank because I was thinking, how much can I say here? This is my first book. And Betsy saying, I think we need something a little more, she said urban, and she was quite right because the book showed jungles, the book cover showed jungles.
Oh, wow.
And it's a book set in, Toronto.
Yeah.
But she was also talking about how the Black culture had been represented in that first original conceptual drawing. So she took it back to the artist who fixed it, more than fixed it. So I have been lucky, but also come from a Caribbean literary world that has been articulate about this kind of thing for a very long time. So I have some of the language, and it helps, I find, to always be ready to walk. If you can't make someone understand, to pack up your writing and take it elsewhere.
Well, given that Race Fail began at least around that original post around writing the other, I had one writing question for you about writing the other. Love triangles are the default in this world, but Vikosi, in his premarital period himself, is at the nexus of two love triangles, one with his future husband and future wife, and one with a woman and a man that are Mermeki. And there is an epic sex scene, which you've already alluded to in the book, long, graphic, detailed, and extremely intense between two men. So I wondered if we could just spend a moment more on it and how you went about it, your thoughts about writing across difference, and also, for that matter, writing sex more generally, which is such a difficult thing to pull off, I think, in writing, or something that people sometimes avoid for fear of not pulling it off. Let's put it that way.
Took me 10 years to write that scene, I think. But yeah, writing sex scenes, I think of it as any kind of choreography, writing dance scenes, sex scenes, or fight scenes. You need to be aware of leading the reader through the touch points between not just the characters, but their environments. And you need to be able to do so in a way that is unashamed of body and that recognizes dynamic movement. Starting my science fiction journey very early with the feminist writers to thank for being frank about bodies. I definitely have Chip Delaney to thank
Yes.
for doing that and for writing sex scenes that are fearless. And in my first writing early on, whenever I knew I wanted to write a sex scene and I'd be scared, I'd think, what would Chip Delaney do? And then I'd throw myself in. And part of what I do is I remind myself that when I'm writing it, nobody's seeing me, nobody's seeing the words. I can do whatever the hell I want. I can put anything down on the page. Think about it afterwards, just get it down on the page. And that helps a whole lot because I find I have enough ego that if I manage to get through that scary process and then I look at what I've written and find it mostly good, I'm not going to just hide it. I'm going to include it in what I'm writing. Writing the unfamiliar, I try to find not only the places that are different, and I ask people about it. So I have given this scene to people to read who would know more about what it's like than I do. But I also try to find the places that are similar. Bodies are similar, sexual acts are similar, even if I'm pretending it's coming from a different type of character than me, the sensory nature of it, I know to be kind of delicate. So so I do it that way, and I really kind of not realizing it at the time, but realizing it now, sort of drew on the romance trope of the two people who are hate each other and are drawn to each other, and finally in one big, burst of simultaneous hatred and erotic arousal, finally get together. So once I finally wrote the scene, it wrote itself really, really quickly, despite my having avoided it. I've made some changes to it, but not too many. But anything that I felt I would have needed to make, I would have done.
Well, I wanted to spend the rest of our time with the question of language and literature in the book, the aspect of your world building among many things that I love that I think I was most enamored with. We know right as the story opens that books are sacred objects, and perhaps there's been a rupture in the archive, an erasure, as Vikosi is involved in rescuing the last known copies of given books. We learn that there's punishment for destroying one of these books. But what I loved most is that when a book is recovered, it enters the library, it's quote-unquote shelved, when it is memorized and sung in its entirety before the community. Even books that are completely utilitarian are sung, so you might be listening as much to a book on hydrology as one of great literature. But clearly the oral and the sung is treated with equal reverence to the written in this world you've invented, maybe more so. But both are for sure in a dynamic equilibrium with each other. And it reminds me when I had the Irish writer Doireann na Gríofa on, and she talked about the tradition there of keens, songs that were quote unquote written by women that were sung, memorized and sung, passed down not via books, not via text, but woman to woman, body to body through generations. But unlike the denigrated status of keens compared to the written word in Ireland, in your world, it is central to the function of the archive and the library, the oral and the sung. It also reminds me of something you've said about the Caribbean, that there are no strict boundaries between literatures, that you could be at a literature conference whose guest speakers are Derek Walcott alongside the dance hall singer Lady Saw alongside bell hooks. Perhaps I wonder if this is an extension of that spirit of blending. But either way, talk to us about how you see the oral and the sung, the unwritten in relation to the written in the world of Blackheart Man.
Yeah. For my very first book, the way I hit the voice I wanted was by channeling some of the Caribbean oral traditions of storytelling. So when I'm stuck, I can sort of move into that. It will help me move past and help me seat myself in my own language again. For Blackheart Man, I am referencing griot tradition. So it's a West African tradition that is historian, balladeer, And the griots are musicians who sing the histories. I'm also remembering the way that stories get passed down. Folk tales get told and told and told, and they get changed, but essentially stay the same. And because they are in memory, they can last centuries. Songs are the same thing. We have songs we sing that come to us from God knows where, that we are still singing because there's something about how we remember rhythm and music that gets passed on. We don't forget it. It will change, but we don't forget it. And that was closest I could get in 16th, 17th, 18th century of my story to a digital recording. How do you make something where the knowledge cannot be killed? You make it into a song, make it a catchy one, and people will keep singing it. And so I very naturally went to griot culture and fantasized it. It doesn't work like this. But I remember when I had the intuition that as earnest of having transmogrified this book into something that now will hopefully not die, they destroy the book. They don't actually, but they do a ceremony that where they destroy a copy of the book to sort of signify that it is no longer bound on paper. It has, transcended paper. And that I found really cool because I was also thinking of Timbuktu and of the now digital Library of Alexandria, where some of the texts have been recovered. So part of it was how, in a world that wants to kill you and your traditions, do you keep knowledge going? And so when you talk about me referencing other texts, there are lots of references to older. I went and looked up lost books, some of which we only know about because somebody wrote about them a millennia ago and maybe quoted a little bit of them. And yes, it was everything from the sacred to the profane. It was everything from charts and how to lay pipe to various sexual acts. And that was fun to look up and to refer to sort of ground the book back into bits of our reality. And I just love the idea of these people going out and going on it's like a vision quest where they spend their research as grad students finding one of these lost books, and then they go out into the world and bring the actual book back. And that's like catnip to a writer's heart.
I just love that. And that they bring it back and it gets codified through singing.
Yeah.
It's so great.
Yeah.
There are many ways you blend things that are otherwise, I think, kept apart, not just the oral and the written, not just the blending of what is considered literature and what is dismissed as not a part of it. I know that outside the book, you're interested in fabric and textiles. You've mentioned the website Spoonflower that allows you to custom design them. And another aspect of Blackheart Man is that it makes you incredibly hungry, as you're always describing the making of meals in detail, the conjuring of smells, the naming of ingredients, whether bammy cakes or the liberal use of chives and cinnamon together, which makes me suspect you're an amazing cook. So thinking of blending, of weaving, of cooking ingredients into a whole, as a first step to talking more about this element of the book, we have a question for you from someone who themselves is iconic for many discrete things, whether Roots or Reading Rainbow or Star Trek, and yet is also indelibly known as LeVar Burton. So here's a question for you from LeVar.
Well,
one of the things that can happen when you fall into Nalo's orbit is that you discover all of these other talents that she possesses. Nalo has a passion for tea. She's all about tea. And my wife, Stephanie, is too. They have that in common. They share that passion for tea. And over time, Nalo has sent Stephanie teas that she herself has blended. Brilliant mixtures of different things. Like she's got one tea that Nalo sent that has gunpowder pearls in it. I love that. I just love the idea of drinking gunpowder and pearls combined. Anyway, my question is, Nalo, when did you discover not simply this passion, but this talent that you have for speaking through tea, this talent for blending different elements in an elegantly alchemical way?
Levar is amazing. He is partly correct. I do love blending things to make new foods. I have sent food I brought food to him and his wife and to his crew when he interviewed me for his podcast. But he's actually confusing me with somebody else. And I think I know who, and I'm really very honored to be confused with them because this person and I have a lot in common. And we share a love for food and share a love for making our own food. When you meet as many people as somebody like Vivar does, it's not surprising that he might occasionally mix two people up because I don't meet half as many people as he does. And I honestly do not recognize people from one minute to the next. But he's got the essence of it. I took Caribbean black cake for him and his crew when he was interviewing me. If ever there was a hybrid food, black cake is it. It's a Christmas thing. So the talent for blending and talking through food, I say would probably have started with my mother. My family tended to move every few years to a different country, usually in the Caribbean, but not always. And we were not wealthy at all. So it was on my mother, who was the main cook. My dad did cook, but not all the time. But it was on her to find foods that were nutritious and delicious. So she would go into the market and start pointing at things and say, what is that? What do you do with it? And it's her ingenuity, I think, that I have been drawing on that's made me unafraid to experiment with blending in general. And I guess I have imported it into my own writing, not only through food, but because it's also very much a feature of Caribbean writing. We come from so many different traditions and different nations that to blend them is quite natural. The story of the Caribbean is a story of hybridization, story of creolization. It's a story of many cultures that came together, many by force through colonization, and that have had to find ways to continue and have had to find ways to not lose all of our origin cultures. And so the blending shows up all the time in Caribbean art, in the way that Caribbean people speak, where we'll code switch from one language into the bits of another that still remain, so that there are a lot of words in Trinidadian English, for instance, that are French and Spanish. And that's right in there is a history of who was doing the cold medicine, right? So the blending comes naturally. And I grew up with a lot of the different cuisines from the Caribbean countries in which my family was living. And that's Jamaica, where I and my mother are from, Guyana, where my brother and my father are from, Trinidad and Tobago, where we have so many relatives. And yes, I do cook very well.
It had to be true. I would be shocked if you told me you didn't cook.
I tend not to do anything that takes a long while to cook, 20 minutes and I'm out of there. But I do cook very well and often don't use recipes. I will use a recipe if it's something where the proportions are important, like a pastry or a cake. But anything else, I will very rarely make the same thing twice. It'll have more or less the same ingredients, but there'll be something different. And I like experimenting when I have the resources to do so. I haven't always, but experimenting with what flavors might go with what. And I realized a few years ago that the way I'm able to do that is because I love food, I have a library of tastes in my head. And I can mentally put two together and think, how would that work? I have a feeling that might be okay. Which is how I learned that cloves in savory food, cloves in meat, oh, the meat sparkles. Cloves in fried chicken, damn, like in the batter. So yes, I like putting food in my stories. Again, I will often resort to food when I get stuck. Be like, let's have them have a meal. And with this one, I especially wanted to invent foods. Part of the way I'm signaling this is not consensus reality, this is fantasy, is that some of the foods you would not put those ingredients in food. Just don't dip a stick into a pitch lake and quench it in the soup. Like, don't do that. But that is very much what one of my characters does. And I was imagining what that sulfurous flavor might do to food, how it might improve it. Sometimes I looked things up from other cultures and imported those. But also, I just love Caribbean food. And so I get to write about it. And again, I'm using dynamism. I'm using the kind of metaphors and strong imagery that make your own nerve endings fire, because that's really the only way to describe something like a smell or a taste. And I remember the experience of reading Goblin Market as a kid, Christina Rossetti's poem. And at that point, most of the fruits that are referenced in there, I had never tasted because I was living in the Caribbean. They were from the British Isles. But I felt I could. In my head, I had an imaginary set of tastes because she described them so well that your own imagination kicks in. And of course, when I finally tasted those fruits, most of them were nothing like I imagined, but I had still enjoyed the poem. So I was trying to do that, and I will try to do that when I write about food. I have sometimes blogged about food and posted how I cook things. Yeah, it's very, very important to me. And it's so much easier than writing a novel. To make a pot of soup is so much easier than writing a novel. And then when you're done, you can eat it.
Yeah. Well, I want to take this notion of blending, of bringing things together and blending them into something more philosophical. Because given that the island is about to be invaded by its original colonizers, it's of vital importance to glean whatever they can from the original time, centuries ago now, that they succeeded at liberating themselves and sending the colonizers away. But the story is at the boundary of legend and history. The story of the three witches who caused the invading soldiers to be swallowed in magic tar seem a little like Granny Nanny and her incredible butt cheek dexterity in redirecting bullets. But Granny Nanny was also a real person, and perhaps there's something real and maybe even strategic and useful within the fantasy to help the people now in fighting back. And one of the great pleasures of being with Vekosi is he's tasked with doing just that, to wade into the myth through the taking of oral testimony. And the question is even asked explicitly in the book, quote, was the existence of this world miraculous or simply natural? Was there a difference? And this question makes me think of a couple things, of my conversation with Adrienne Marie Brown about the relationship between science fiction and activism and organizing, that none of what we achieve can happen without first the act of imagining an otherwise. Or that famous line of Le Guin's, I think the imagination is the single most useful tool mankind possesses. It beats the opposable thumb. I can imagine living without my thumbs, but not without my imagination. Most people seem to think of these two as opposites, fantasy and history, whereas Ursula definitely thought otherwise when she said, the way one does research into non-existent history is to tell the story and find out what happened. I believe this isn't very different from what historians of the so-called real world do. Even if we are present at some historical event, do we comprehend it? Can we even remember it until we can tell it as a story? And for events in times or places outside our own experience, we have nothing to go on but the stories other people tell us. Past events exist, after all, only in memory, which is a form of imagination. And she also provocatively connects fantasy with science when she says, there really is nothing to fear in fantasy unless you are afraid of the freedom of uncertainty. This is why it's hard for me to imagine that anyone who likes science can dislike fantasy. Both are based so profoundly on the admission of uncertainty, the welcoming acceptance of unanswered questions. Of course, the scientist seeks to ask how things are the way they are, not to imagine how they might be otherwise. But are the two operations opposed or related? We can't question reality directly, only by questioning our conventions, our belief, our orthodoxy, our construction of reality. All Galileo said, all Darwin said was, it doesn't have to be the way we thought it was. And it feels to me like the gesture in Blackheart Man of bringing fantasy and history together, of sort of traveling to that borderlands between the two and seeing what can be pulled forth to do real material action for liberation now. It feels kindred to this to me. And so I was wondering what your thoughts are on fantasy in relationship to the so-called real, or to the archive, or to the historical, or to the retrieval of story from within a rupture and an erasure.
Yes, Ursula is quite right. Story is often all we have, and story is how human beings understand the world and each other. It's very akin to how empathy works, that we're able to map our own experience onto someone else's unfamiliar one and find kinship. That's something that we do at the body level as well as the brain level, says the non-scientist. And fantasy and science fiction are allowed to speculate, allowed to theorize, allowed to tell a story that may or may not be true. Science typically does not do that, but they have to start from a theory in order to figure out even what direction an experiment is going to go in. So there is a whole lot of connection between the two sets of processes. In some ways, both are trying to find a working narrative to understand the world. In fiction, that narrative only has to feel like it makes sense. It has to have a dream logic. In science, there needs to be proof. But a lot of the time when I'm doing research for my novels, it's science that I look to be able to then take that material and create a story from it. And I know lots of scientists who have been inspired by science fiction and fantasy to get into that field. I think we are kissing cousins. It's not as simple as lies and truth. And humans being humans, sometimes we tell what we think is the truth of a thing, and in fact, we're telling a story. And I love that uncertainty. I mean, I like knowing the truth of things, but I also like that sometimes the answer is we don't exactly know. Part of what I was doing in the novel is the idea that the real world is somehow mundane and that fantasy is our escape. When we look at the real world, that everything that had to come together to make us us, to get to the point where I'm sitting in one country and you're in another and we're talking in real time, to anything, that's kind of miraculous right there. And just because there are scientific processes that led it to happen does not take away from its magic, from its miraculousness. So I was sort of playing with the idea that the world is magical, it's miraculous. It sometimes can be explained. There's a lot we can. Good, that doesn't take away from the fact that everything around us is wondrous. So that's something I feel pretty strongly as somebody who sort of sits on the border myself between science and fantasy, having been able to get only so far into the sciences and having moved into storytelling instead, but still having a respect and a need for the science. I mean, I needed to figure out, if you're going to write a camel with indigestion, you need to figure out how that happens. You have to go and ask camel herders, which is sort of what I did. And they're talking about very real biology. How do you heal a camel who's, ingested something that's going to make it explode if you don't stop it? That's science, that's biology. So even though there's fantasy happening, there's always reality. And it doesn't help to get your girdle in too much of a knot trying to figure out the difference when you're talking about story.
Well, as we near the end, I wanted to ask you about the actual vernacular in your work. What's interesting is that you are both bringing real Caribbean vernacular into your work from Trinidad, Jamaica, and Guyana, and yet also creating a fantasy vernacular from it, much like the way the book is both alternate history and fantastical created history. There was an interesting roundtable on your work at Strange Horizons, and several of the people involved were from Trinidad and could recognize dialect or phrasings or syntax, but nevertheless, they too had to find their footing, even if they knew one of the modes of speech that was one of the ingredients in the vernacular that you cooked up for a given book. We all, in one way or the other, are working with the familiar and unfamiliar as we learn the mode of speech in a given novel of yours. Karen Lord even called this new book a master class in language. Speaking of this element, you've said that it was the influence of your father and of Kamal Brathwaite to privilege common speech in your work. And because of this, you've said that you already always had permission to write like this, and that you were writing both from this Caribbean tradition, but also inspired by the negative examples of it too, the mockery of the tradition in characters like Jar Jar Binks in Star Wars, or the lobster in The Little Mermaid. But on the Caribbean Science Fiction Network podcast, you also said, in contrast, that every few years you had to give yourself permission all over again to write in your natural language. So I wondered if you could speak to working in both the real and the invented blended vernaculars, and any thoughts you might convey to others wanting to do something similar with their own cultures and dialects.
It's something I get asked often now. And I should say that another early example I had was Jamaican poet Louise Bennett Coverley, who got chided the first time she did an appearance and was using Jamaican speech, and got chided in Jamaican speech. If that's your mother sent you to school for? That's what your mother sent you to school to learn? And I've just done it in more Trinidadian than Jamaican because my Jamaican accent is quite bad. But yes, I did grow up with that permission. My dad moved my family every few years, Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, the US, back, Jamaica, Trinidad, Canada. I don't even remember the order anymore. So in each place, I was picking up a new set of vernaculars. And at one point could switch into them, except Jamaican. Jamaica is hard for me for some reason. Could switch into them sort of as the plane was coming down. My Trinidadian is better than my Guyanese, and they're both better than my Jamaican. I am also, by natural brain wiring, I have nonverbal learning disorder, which is on the autistic spectrum. They describe it as a disorder, but the plus side is I have a really good ability to understand how language works. And I'm fascinated with words and meaning and syntax and pronunciation. So it's always there. And it's kind of natural for me to play with it and to hear the difference in register and the difference in vocabulary amongst socioeconomic differences, even in the same language, sometimes the same vernacular, and the same language. So that's what I decided to do with Blackheart Man, was to play with it. I mean, there's an amazing novel by the late Martin Mordecai, Jamaican writer, called Free, where he writes in 19th century Jamaican English in portions of it. And that thing is a PhD. He did not invent that. He found the language, as well as telling just a really, really brilliant saga. It's a big story. But you go back farther and farther and you're only finding pieces of it. Well, my dad was also a Shakespearean actor. So you have access to some of the ways of speech. And I created a colonizing culture that speaks English, so I could use the ways in which English has worked over the centuries. And I could also use the ways in which English has been defiantly changed by colonized peoples. And I could use English's really plastic habit of importing words from other languages. So I had a field day. It was like, I don't know, letting me loose with the Legos. And a lot of it you have to speak aloud to get a feel for a rhythm. But it is a talent I have that I really quite enjoy.
Well, I know we can expect your new short story collection shortly. Is there anything else coming down the Nalo Hopkinson highway?
Yes, I'm not sure when, because life has intervened with some of the artists, but I have written the script of a graphic novel that I'm collaborating with John Jennings and Stephen Bissett on. Stephen Bissett being one of the artists in the original Constantine and Swamp Thing. So the script is written, it's handed in, the artwork is going to take a bit longer. So I don't know quite when that's coming out. One could hope for 2025, but it's probably going to be more like 2026 at this rate. It is a road novel, a road story that's a horror story that draws on African-American history. So the three of us put Zora Neale Hurston, the writer and journalist and sociologist, in a car with Eugene Bullard, who was the first Black fighter pilot, who was not allowed to be in the US Army because of the color of his skin, so went to France and ended up being in the army there. We've put them in a car with each other to go and investigate killings along the Green Book routes. And the killings are by snakes, which shouldn't be possible because it's December. So it's a horror story. They have to find out what's wrong. Bad things happen, and they don't much like each other. So that was fun to write to and to research. There's two people with just these amazing, rich lives who are, by the time of our graphic novel, nearing the ends of their lives, but don't know it. They both died quite young. But they both bring so much to the story, and they have to fight with each other to get to each other enough to figure out what to do. And that was great to write with both Steve and John, who between them have probably more years of experience than I have years. So I would email one or the other and go, so what's it called in comics where you do that thing? We were trying to signify that someone's moving really fast. And they would come back with a word, and I'd say, okay, that. And I'd put it in my in my descriptions. It was a lovely process. I can't remember what it's called. Night Comes Walking. Yeah, from a Zora Neale Hurston title. And John has actually written a blues for it. Yeah.
Can't wait.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Nalo, for spending this time with me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
We've been talking today to Nalo Hopkinson about her latest novel, Blackheart Man. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. You can find more of Nalo Hopkinson's work at nalohopkinson.com. If you enjoyed today's conversation, consider transforming yourself from a listener to a listener supporter by joining the Between the Covers community, and help keep this quixotic endeavor going forward into the future. Every supporter can join our brainstorm of future guests, and every listener supporter receives the supplementary resources with each conversation of things I discovered while preparing, things referenced during it, and places to explore once you're done listening. Additionally, there are a variety of other potential gifts and rewards, including the bonus audio archive with contributions by everyone from Daniel Jose Older to N.K. Jemison to Sophia Samatar to Vajra Chandrasekhara's translation and discussion of the political implications of a story that he reads for us. There's the Tin House Early Readership subscription, getting 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public. There are rare collectibles from past guests, including some 1980s vintage Twilight Zone and Interzone magazines from Karen Joy Fowler, to a bundle of books selected and curated by me and sent to you. You can find out more at patreon.com/betweenthecovers, or if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elizabeth DeMeo and Elisa Ogie in the book division, Beth Steidel in the art department, Becky Kramer and Jay Nichelle in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the Summer and Winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank past Between the Covers guest, poet, musician, composer, filmmaker, performer, and much more, Alicia Jo Rabins, for making the intro and outro for the show. You can find out more about her work at aliciajo.com. ALICIAJO.com.